How do you square up with the person that accumulated student debt, has spent the last 10 years or longer, finally has the student debt paid off, and then the next day the bailout comes for people that have student debt?
That's interesting. And what do you foreclose on?
Right.
In the housing fiasco, there was at least some tangible asset of which to recover. I mean, it may have been worth pennies on the dollar. You may have had a $400,000 mortgage on a home that's all of a sudden worth $200,000, but there was an asset there. There was something there you could liquidate in some way, shape, or form to recover a certain amount of that financial investment. What do you do with this education?
You can't take it back.
You can't take it back. I mean, and to your point, when the bailout comes, who loses and who wins? What about the person who just paid back $100,000 in student debt? A year later, the bailout comes and the government goes through some forgiveness plan or program. That's where we're headed. I found some interesting numbers, and then I want to go to something I think a lot of our listeners don't know and would be interested in. We said yesterday, and this is the latest, the absolute latest number, we have $1.48 trillion in student debt. 44.2 million Americans have student debt. The student loan delinquency rate is 11.2%. The delinquency rate, remember the movie The Big Short? His whole strategy was when the delinquency rate gets to 9%, the market collapses. I mean, that was Michael Burry's whole strategy. That's the reason he made that short bet. When the delinquency rate gets to 9%, the mortgage industry in America and the housing market will collapse under its own weight. So right now, student loan delinquency is 11.2%. I don't know how many of you knew we have a public service loan forgiveness program. There's about 1 million borrowers in that program, and if you make 121 timely monthly payments while working full-time in the public service, the rest of your loan is forgiven. If you're a bureaucrat and you work 120 consecutive months and make timely payments, then the balance of your loan is forgiven. I don't know who's forgiven to, but it's forgiven. Here's interesting, and here's what I was talking about yesterday. Of the $1.48 trillion, there's $535 billion on time. These are good loans. These are loans that are being serviced. The consumer, in this case, the former student, is making the payment. The family may be helping. They may not be helping. We talked yesterday, 27% of adults over the age of 55 have dipped into their retirement accounts to help their kid service the student debt. So we got about 1/3 of all the student debt payments, $535 billion, 16.6 million borrowers, that is on time. These are good loans. These would be AAA in the world of Wall Street. Loans in deferment, $113 billion. Loans in forbearance, $100 billion. Loans in default, about $80 billion. Loans in grace period, about $100 billion. So we get, I mean, think about this. You've got about 2/3 of all the student debt in some form of deferment, forbearance, default, grace period, or forgiveness. Now, the ones in forbearance, deferment, and grace period are not even amongst the 11.2% that are delinquent. I mean, just think of that. Get your arms around that. We've got 11.2% that are delinquent. And then we've got whatever the percentage is in deferment, forbearance, default, grace period, and forgiveness. The numbers don't work. The numbers should scare the ever-loving daylights out of us. And going back to the numbers, did you know that we have spent $1.3 trillion in the Iraq War? Cumulatively. Since the first day we got there until the last day of 2017, we spent $1.31 trillion in the war in Iraq. Now, there's a lot of other numbers people throw around. That's the number. We have spent more, or excuse me, the American public owe more in student debt than we spent in the Iraq War. And I'm not talking about personnel and salaries because they'd be paid anyway. I'm talking about the cost of the war because there's a number out there about 2.1 or 2.2 trillion. The reality is that's the soldiers' pay and compensation and all these ancillary things that are associated with the military, whether they're fighting in Iraq or not. And I mean, just get your arms around those numbers. There is no question the model is broken, terribly broken. There's a research paper at Harvard, and you ask what happens And I think this is interesting. When you don't make your house payment, they take your home. They short sale. They do all these other creative things to get it off their books. The last thing the bank wants is a house. The last thing they want is 100 or 1,000 houses. But you ask what happens. Here's what I believe happens. And here's where Harvard and I agree. Harvard Business School did kind of an expose research paper. They believe in the next 20 years, 50% of the universities will be out of business.
What?
Well, you're already seeing societal trends. I mean, there are fewer people enrolling in college. The Wall Street Journal has a big article, a month or so ago. The number of people who believe college is worth the investment has gone from about 69% to about 51 or 2%. That means half of the American public are really beginning to question whether college is worth the money we spend on it, or ask our kids and families of kids to spend on it or not. And that goes back to JT's comments yesterday. People want to hear what people want to hear. If you're a guy on the radio and you question higher education, it's easy for the academia of America to run around saying, well, that's an idiot opposed to education. I mean, he doesn't want an educated country. No, that's ridiculous. That shows your lack of intellect and inform and understanding. I mean, that's a ridiculous statement for anybody to make. All I'm arguing is, and all I have argued it, and I will continue to argue, because I know in my heart I'm right. I told you, and I asked you yesterday, was I a contrarian? You said, yeah, probably so. I'll agree to that. But I'm not a non-informed or ill-informed contrarian. It goes back to my business life. And I said yesterday, the most important thing I ever did in my business life was when I evaluated whether to do something or not, why wouldn't it work? I'd convince myself it would work, or I wouldn't even consider it. So I had to go through the A, B's, and C's of why won't this work? This model is broken. This model does not sustain. And for people that run around the country saying, well, if you say that, you're opposing education in America. And to Larry's point, Larry made a very valid point. There are examples where we need to loan money for kids to go to college. There's no question about that. I would argue there are good examples of granting money to kids to go to college. I'm not totally opposed to that. Let's not loan kids money. Let's give kids money via grants in certain situations and circumstances. But when you look at the numbers, the math does not work. Rev, not only does it not work, it ain't close to working. I mean, it's not even remotely in the same stratosphere or universe of working. And I think it's interesting to get to a point of, okay, why did so many kids all of a sudden believe college was so important? I mean, why did we wake up one day and everybody in America believed that the pathway to prosperity was via a college education and a degree from one of our prestigious universities? That's a very good question. I got an answer. How many of you have a friend who doesn't have a college degree, who is phenomenal at what he does, but he can't work his way up the food chain? Why? Because he doesn't have that college degree. And that's one of the most asinine positions to hold in regards to who can or cannot do a job. Now, get why we do it, but here's why. And I'm not saying, once again, this is the reason, but this is absolutely a contributing factor. In 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court decided a case called Griggs versus Duke Power Company. That's a locally known entity. Griggs versus Duke Power Company. The subject of the lawsuit and the litigation was employment requirements. Duke's practice pre the Supreme Court decision, and many other companies at this time, was to give job applicants an IQ test. Supposedly, this let them hire qualified people, but then along came the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and it banned, as part of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, it banned pre-employment tests that were not a reasonable measure of job performance. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 argued that just because a person is dumb doesn't mean he can't do a good job, and just because he's smart doesn't mean he will do a good job. Up until then, that was the way the private sector felt was best to evaluate and vet candidates for employment. That changed during the 1964 Civil Rights Act when they banned, here's the exact language, pre-employment tests that were not a reasonable measure of job performance. The court ruled that Duke's tests were too broad and not directly related to the job performed, and deemed those tests illegal and unconstitutional. That left a problem, right? How were employees supposed to evaluate job applicants without illegally discriminating against one person or another. We can't give an IQ test. We believe as a business owner, we're better off hiring smart people with high IQs, but the court said you can't do that. And then you start talking about soft skills and hard skills, who can perform the specific tasks that go with this particular job, operating a piece of machinery correctly, writing computer code would be an example nowadays. These would be the hard skills required a person in their place of employment. And then there's soft skills. And soft skills are, can I give you a crappy job and you not pout about it? You keep a smile on your face, stay committed. These unpleasant assignments, will you follow through to the end? Will you show up on time? Doesn't take a rocket scientist to show up on time, but those are soft skills. Can you work with other people? Those are other soft skills. The people that employed began dealing with these situations and circumstances, and academic went to the business world and said, look, we can't give IQ tests because the courts have ruled we can't. But we believe it's reasonable to expect someone who goes to college to be able to deal with these hard skills and soft skills. So why don't y'all agree that the more college graduates you have in your workforce, but there is no science to this. That's what I've never understood about it. There is no science to show company full of college graduates outperforms a company without college graduates. Now, we've accepted that as truth, but that's what the unserious American people tend to do from time to time. We take people at face value. But that's how we got here. We got here because in 1971, and I'm not saying that's the only reason, but in 1971, Griggs versus Duke Power was heard by the Supreme Court. They disallowed the private sector and businesses giving IQ tests to base their employment analysis on or not. The members of academia saw a vacuum and a void in that place. The business community were struggling with how to decide who to hire and who not to hire. Colleges convinced business owners that that diploma shows some of the hard skills and and yet it does. There's no question about that. There is no question that the diploma shows some of the hard skills and soft skills necessary to be a good employee. That's why I've argued the fact that career earnings are $1 million more of a college graduate than a non-$1 million, and you're basing that analysis on the value of that diploma. That's a ridiculous argument. You're basing it on the fact that that person was probably going to do better whether they had a diploma or not. Why? Because they're probably smarter, one. They probably have better hard skills, two. And they probably have better soft skills, three. The reason they're making $1 million more is simply because in 1971, Duke Energy and all the other corporations in America were disallowed from using an IQ test. They had to find some other vetting process, and a diploma seemed to be the most logical and reasonable and practical application of a replacement to that. Now, the problem is, at that time, in that moment, only about 16% of Americans were college graduates. The average tuition to a college was about $2,100. Now, I think it's about $1,900 per year. And then everybody saw that, look, I've got to have a college degree to do that job. Why? It's a good question. I've got to have a college degree. Read the online ad. I talked to the human resource manager. They told me I had to have a college degree to do this. Why in the world do you have to have a college degree to do that? What in the world would they ever teach you in college to allow you to be any better at that than you would if you would not go to college? We know that's the truth. And that's why I call it a racket. When you created a world where so many people began to believe they needed a degree, whether they did or not, they believed they needed one. It skewed the market. It manipulated the market. And then the federal government became the backstop or the guarantor to somewhere between 70 and 80% of the student debt. And guess what happened? The price began to creep up. What if the government subsidized everybody to keep their radio on 95.3 every morning? How do you think our ratings would be? I mean, just imagine a world where the government subsidized everybody out there. If you'll lock your radio on 95.3, we'll send you a check. Guess what happens to our ratings, Rev?
I think we do pretty good.
Okay. What do we start charging people to advertise on this radio show? You think we'd increase the price?
Yeah.
Of course we would. And that's the dynamic that's happened to higher education. Now we can argue the decrease in government funding. The General Assembly of South Carolina has decreased the funding to USC and Clemson, and there is a legitimate debate to be had there. But why has private institutions gone up? That's where I don't believe that General Assembly argument holds much water. Because if it was all about the General Assembly cutting funding, then Wofford and Furman, who are private schools, they'd be more attractive and a better deal. That's not the case. Anytime you loan money to purchase a commodity, you manipulate the market and you drive the price of that good up. And there's one sure thing about a bubble. A bubble is created when you ask people to pay more for that commodity than what it's really worth, and sooner or later, the market runs out of gas.